and partners throughout the region, as well as in Europe and elsewhere, continue to enhance ties and work together to undergird peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific moving forward. As a reminder, today's event is open to the public and on the record. Our audience members joining through Zoom can submit their questions at any time using the Q&A function. And as moderator, I'll raise questions to our distinguished panelists. We're really fortunate today to be hosting General Jones and Undersecretary Flournoy, and I'm eager to jump into the discussion to hear their insights. Let me introduce them both briefly, and I've worked with for both of them throughout my career, so thrilled to have them here. First, we're honored to have General James Jones with us today. He's a retired U.S. Marine Corps four-star general who served as the 22nd U.S. National Security Advisor for President Obama. He was also the Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps. He was also SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, and he had many other senior positions across the U.S. national security establishment. We also are very honored to have Ms. Michelle Flournoy, who is co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors, former co-founder and chief executive officer of the Center for a New American Security, where she currently serves as chair of its board of directors. Ms. Flournoy also served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012, where she was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and much more. Ms. Flournoy recently visited Taiwan last month as part of a delegation of former U.S. senior defense and security officials sent by President Joe Biden. And so we're really excited to hear her insights from that trip today. I'd like to kick off the discussion now by asking each of our speakers to offer a few minutes of their top level thoughts on the topic for today's event. So we'll start with Undersecretary Flournoy, and then we'll hear from General Jones, and then we'll bring it into the discussion. So over to you, Undersecretary Flournoy. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm honored to share the stage with General Jones, and great to see you, Barry, and thank you to you and the Atlantic Council for convening this important conversation. Very, very timely. So I think we have to think about Russia-Ukraine and the crisis as in the context in which it's happening in terms of Chinese-Russian relations. Just before Putin's invasion, we saw Putin and Xi together at the Olympics, signing a major document declaring their alignment and cooperation. And that alignment has been growing, and the cooperation has been deepening in recent years. And I think, so when Xi looks at what's happening in Russia-Ukraine, he's clearly thrown his support behind Russia's efforts because it aligns with his objectives to call into question US leadership, call into question the democratic model, divide as much as possible the transatlantic alliance and divide Europe from the US. And so I think initially he was, very supportive of this effort and still is. I think, though, as this has not gone well for Putin, as Putin's initial military plan has failed, as the Russians have turned to directly targeting civilian populations with brutal attacks and now charges of apparent war crimes, I think, Xi is almost certainly mindful of some of the reputational risks to him by associating too closely with this campaign. And so we've begun to see the rhetoric of Chinese diplomats, sort of play both sides of the issue, soften some of their stance. But behind the scenes, all the evidence points to quiet cooperation by Xi to try to lessen some of the impacts of the sanctions on Russia's economy and to try to support Putin quietly in other ways. That said, I think he will try to stop short of any action that would induce secondary sanctions from the US. So he's kind of walking a tightrope here and very much, I think, aware of the risks to him from the current situation, which has not gone so well for Putin. But ultimately, the real question is, what lessons does he take from this vis-a-vis Taiwan? And that really depends on how this ends and whether Putin walks away claiming victory, or whether he walks away as a lifetime pariah that failed in achieving his objectives in Ukraine. With regard to Taiwan, I would say that my own view is that Xi's preferred approach to Taiwan's reintegration into larger China is not a military one. I often mention for those of you who are Star Trek fans, the absorption into the Borg. His preferred approach is economic, political coercion and absorption. That said, I think he's been very clear that he sees Taiwan's reintegration as a legacy issue, and that if necessary, he will not, he'll use military means to get there if necessary. On the Taiwanese side, it's been very clear that, China has tried to use this moment to intimidate Taiwan. The social media is full of Chinese messaging saying, resistance is futile. Today, Ukraine, tomorrow, Taiwan. But, we can talk more about the trip as we go in the conversation, but I'll just give you my main impression, which was President Tsai is using this crisis to really talk to her own people about the importance of standing up for their democracy, standing up for their freedom. She's made the case that, when you resist, you inspire the, incredibly unified support of the international community to support you. And she's messaging her own people about the importance of readiness, whether it's spending more on asymmetric defense measures, reforming the reserves, or putting together this new civilian mobilization agency. So more to talk about there, but I think both Taiwan and Beijing are certainly watching this Ukraine crisis very closely, because there will be reverberations and implications for Taiwan from however this turns out.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We'll certainly want to return to you for a few more details on the trip, but you've certainly given us a lot to discuss already. And with that, would love to hear General Jones. What are your overall thoughts on this question of the implications of the Russian invasion for Taiwan?
General Jones, you're muted, sir.
Sorry about that. Barry, it's very good to be with you and Michelle this morning. And as usual, I find myself in violent agreement with what Michelle has said. This is a very, very important topic, because how this turns out is going to add to how our world in the 21st century is shaped and our role within it. So not to repeat what Michelle has said, I would say that the United States has a pretty important chore ahead of itself in terms of reestablishing and reinvigorating our relationships with our friends and allies over the last couple of administrations. I think that if you look at the Chinese incursion in Hong Kong, if you look at Russia in Crimea and now in Ukraine and before that in Georgia, you have pretty strong evidence that we have two leaders in those two countries, China and Russia, that have concluded, at least to some degree along the way, that the U.S. commitment to our regional interests is not what it used to be. I think in the Trump administration, canceling the Trans-Pacific Partnership and really not replacing with anything sent a message. I think the Chinese actions in Hong Kong, without too much international condemnation, sent a little bit of the message. And I think President Xi is certainly watching what's going to happen at the end of this Ukraine war that is going on, and that, as Michelle pointed out, is not going well for President Putin. But I think there's still there's still a fair amount to unroll here before we see how this is going to end. But clearly, how it ends is important, and I think President Xi will be very eager to watch what happens to President Putin after this. Will he be treated as the leader of an important country? Will he be received in capitals, or will he be a war criminal? I think how that ends is going to shape how President Xi reacts. I do think that one of the byproducts of our relations in the Ukraine-Russia issue has been that we were probably a little slow in starting up. I think we're doing much better now in terms of reacting to the Russian incursion. But I think one of the lessons I would suggest is that where Taiwan is concerned, we need to make sure that there's no misunderstanding and no weakness in our position. And so we need to do whatever we need to do to shore up the relationship and make sure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself and the commitment from our country. It's clear that there is not just a military aspect to the relationship here. There's a very important Indo-China trade relationship, and I was happy to hear that the administration is working on the new replacement for TPP, because I think the Chinese vortex economically, if not countered by one that we created in terms of if you will, a counter vortex, is really important that the United States lead this effort, because the economic issues here are really dominant, I think, in the region. And to the extent that we can marshal the major countries like Korea, Japan, Australia, India, and the like, in creating kind of a counter vortex to that Chinese expansion, I think is important. We have not talked about the South China Sea, but obviously that's an area where military conflict could occur, and we should be careful there. So I think, as Michelle pointed out, I think that this is a very pivotal issue, and I think it's important that President Xi understands that the military option, at least in the near future, is not in their best interest. And I think we can do a lot to make sure that message gets delivered, but we should not be reactive. I think we should be proactive. Thank you.
Thank you, General Jones. And you too gave us a lot to chew on. I'd love to hear more in a few moments about, okay, what more should we be doing now when you think about Ukraine? And now would love to hear Michelle's more greater details on any insights from the trip. Michelle, you talked about President Tsai talking more to Taiwanese people about the importance of standing up, about inspiring the international community to come to your support. And you said there's a new civilian mobilization agency as well as military readiness efforts, but would love to hear a little bit more. And also as a second part, what should we be thinking about doing now, as General Jones said, in a proactive nature? There probably are things we wish we would have done, and they're different situations, but wish we would have done in helping to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine, or at least defend Ukraine, help defend Ukraine. Are there some really urgent things we should be thinking about now that we haven't yet done regarding Taiwan, which is a very different situation, but nonetheless there are some lessons. So sorry for the long wind up, but
it's it is the question. I think with regard to Taiwan, there's always been a long-standing part of U.S. policy since Kissinger and Nixon's trips to China has been, in addition to the One China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act, where we've made a commitment as a whole of government, Congress and one administration after the next, to support Taiwan's in its self-defense capability. And I think the key shift that I see that needs to happen now is, in the past, we've given them things like F-16s and major U.S. platforms, or we haven't given them, we've sold them through the FMS process. But I think one of the lessons learned from Ukraine is we really need to help them with asymmetric defense. We need to help Taiwan become a little porcupine that is very indigestible to a Chinese aggressor. We need to enable them to slow down any forces coming in, to make it costly for them, make it difficult for them, and if they actually reach Taiwan, to have a very organized resistance and way of buying time. Because if the international community is going to respond to help Taiwan in its defense against unprovoked aggression, they need time to arrive. And so I think there's a whole host of things that Taiwan can do to try to buy time. And that means some reorientation of how they're spending on defense, some reorientation of what they're training on, a reorientation of what we're providing in our FMS pipeline, and this engagement with the civilian population to help organize the society for resistance if that becomes necessary. The good news is there's a very strong tradition of volunteerism in Taiwan. There are volunteer firefighters and police auxiliaries and people who help at hospitals and so forth. But the mobilization agency idea is to kind of organize all that in the event of either a natural disaster or a conflict or crisis, to be able to draw together the military component and the civilian component. But in terms of what we should do more broadly, I know that this administration has put a great emphasis on bolstering deterrence. This notion of integrated deterrence, particularly with regard to Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And there's a lot in the budget that are sort of long-term investments that will improve our posture and our capabilities to keep our edge and be able to do that. But I would love to see more attention on this near-term risk. If after the 20th Party Congress and various economic and political efforts are not successful for Xi, and he decides that, my odds of success are only going to get worse as the US puts more into the theater, as we field more cutting edge capabilities and so forth, there is this near-term problem that, 4 or 5 years from now, you could see, a decision that, okay, this is, the best time for us to move. And so there's a different deterrence problem, which says, how do you take what's already in hand, the existing platforms, capabilities, mature technologies, combine them in new ways with new operational concepts that meaningfully enhance deterrence in the near term before all of these longer term investments come online. And so that, to me, needs to be a primary area of focus for the Department of Defense in the near term, very near term.
I think that's right, Michelle, and very thoughtful. We've all known for a long time that the FMS pipeline to Taiwan is very much platform centric and not always harnessed as jointly as everybody would like. And we've certainly seen the Russian version of what jointness does not look like. And so I think that's a really important, maybe the most important lesson learned from what's going on in Ukraine, is to use this asymmetric, what I call the anti-force, anti-tank, anti-missile, anti-air, et cetera. I think that's really important. General Jones, what are your thoughts on this question? And I do think when you were talking about how Taiwan defends itself and the importance of the economic questions regarding Indo-Pacific security, I immediately thought of this integrated deterrence concept coming out of the Defense Department right now. I wonder if economic is so important to China and to Taiwan. Are there things that could be done now? Should European countries, should Germany say to China, in a declaratory policy, if you invade Taiwan, we are going to join the U.S. in sanctions. Shouldn't there be some kind of coordinated effort for integrated deterrence of Chinese attack on Taiwan in some way?
Yeah, I think that would be a terrific thing to do. What I worry about the most is that we will be reactive instead of proactive, and I think we need to be proactive on this so there's no misunderstanding. Yeah, I think the military aspect of it is obviously built around the concept of deterrence, and to make it, if we can, so that the Chinese do not underestimate the degree of difficulty here, as President Putin's team has underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to fight for their country. And I would think that the Taiwanese are equally determined to defend their homeland, and as long as they have the capability to do so, that in itself is a big deterrence. But I think the United States really needs to reestablish itself as committed to our friends and allies in the region, and I think we've had to do some reparations in different parts of the world as well, as a result of previous administrations who may have not. It may have given the impression to our friends and allies, including some of our NATO members, that we are pulling back. We're less. We're not committed as we once were, and I think that may have encouraged some of the actions taken by the Russians and the Chinese with regard to some of the moves that they've made in the past. I do think the economic aspect is really important, and this counter vortex idea is a good one, but it has to be led by someone, and to me that's a great opportunity for the United States to come back in the region with something to replace the Trans-Pacific partnership program that was canceled during the Trump administration, which I thought was a big mistake, and a bigger mistake was not replacing it with something to take its place. I think the Chinese, I think that's part of the deterrence aspect, that what would happen to the Chinese economy if our friends and allies joined us with a very clear statement that if you do this, you can be sure that this is what will happen. And I think there's obviously a military aspect of this, but I think there's an equally important political and diplomatic consequence, economic consequence, just all kinds of things that I think we could put on the table in a proactive way. And I don't mean to humiliate the Chinese, but I mean to communicate with the Chinese in a way that's unmistakable in terms of its seriousness, and should be taken and received seriously by the Chinese.
Thank you, General Jones. I did want to spend a little more time on this economic question and sort of stepping back. We've seen kind of two strategic shocks already this year, with first the February 4th statement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin that their cooperation, knows no limits, 5,000-word statement. I mean, this is, an alliance in all but name. So very significant for U.S. national security. And then secondly, obviously the Russian invasion. On the economic instruments, especially if we see China continuing to try to coerce Taiwan economically, the administration put out its Indo-Pacific economic framework, which I think is meant to be sort of the next step. But there's not that much meat on the bones yet. So I was wondering, Michelle, if you wanted to comment at all on sort of how should we think about that framework, and should we be doing more now to put meat on the bones and negotiate with Indo-Pacific allies and partners? Because I do think that the counter vortex strategy that General Jones raises is a really important one to send messages to China. There is a difficulty though, because I think that Chinese trade with the U.S. and other countries is likely a pretty big percentage of our GDPs compared to Russian trade with Europe. So I think that's a bit of a hurdle, but love to hear your thoughts on the economic questions.
No, I agree entirely with General Jones in terms of the importance of having an economic strategy for Asia. I think and I agree that the failure of the U.S. to actually, having led the negotiation, actually join the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a key party was a real strategic loss for the United States, and very much hurt us in the region, and hurt perceptions of the United States leadership and reliability in the region, and created an opening for China to step in, which is quite ironic and disturbing. But anyway, I do think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is intended to be kind of the new initiative. You're right, there's not a lot of meat on the bones yet. I do think that there's a lot of discussion about a potential digital trade treaty that could potentially emerge as a first step. One of the challenges the administration faces is just the politics of trade in this country. And given our deep polarization domestically, and given the presidential elections coming up in 2024, it's not realistic to expect Congress to give the administration the authority to negotiate, substantial new trade agreements. I think beyond that, when you look back at the history of NAFTA and its sort of initial attempt and then its revival and ultimate passage, it was only after Bill Clinton was in his second term, after the second midterms, that he was able to pull it together politically to get it done. So, our own politics are one of the biggest barriers to doing these very strategic economic agreements that we should be doing, from a strategy perspective. On the issue of U.S.-Taiwan economics and the potential of threatening sanctions, we have to be mindful that the Chinese economy is very, very different than the Russian economy and much more integrated. It is a major market for us and for all of our allies. It is also a major part of our supply chains. And so I think there's some really good work. This is, maybe a future assignment for the think tank folks in the crowd. There's a lot of good work to be done on really assessing, given that interdependency and given the much greater importance of China in the global economy, how could you craft sanctions or market constraints or measures that would be effective and would be, acceptable and feasible for us and for our allies in terms of the second and third order effects on our economies. We've already experienced some, tough effects from the Russia sanctions, even though we have very little economic engagement with Russia. But, the price of oil is set globally and traded globally, and so it's impacting us. Anyway, I just think these are very different situations, and the tools will have to be applied differently with different likely outcomes. So we need to really do some analysis, be proactive and get ahead of that and do some analysis of that before a crisis.
I think that's a great assignment, Michelle. General, I didn't know if you had additional thoughts on that question. How do we use economic instruments when we're so entangled with China, with so much of our GDPs interdependent?
Well, it's clearly part of our arsenal of in responding to anything China might do with regard to Taiwan. But I think it's also an opportunity for the United States to repair some of the and remove some of the doubts that exist with our friends and allies, and perhaps Japan, Korea, Australia, and the like, about what is our real resolve with regard to the region, and that needs to be. I think that needs to be shored up as quickly as we possibly can. This topic this morning is about, Taiwan and China, but what's going on in the world right now, particularly with Russia and Ukraine, is we're talking about democracy versus authoritarian governments. And there are other dictators around the world that are watching very closely. I'm thinking of certain countries on the African continent and maybe even in our own hemisphere that will be very curious to see how President Putin emerges from this contest. And I think it's very important that we hold fast with our allies that puts a lifelong altered state, if you will, on President Putin as the leader of the Russian Federation. And I think President Xi will watch that very carefully, because I'm sure he won't want to suffer the same fate. On the other hand, if we show weakness and we get to a point where, Vladimir Putin is once again, the welcome at the Munich Security Conference and other international conferences like that, I think that would be a very sad mistake, and that will embolden not only President Xi, but other dictators in different parts of the world who are bent on oppressing their people and following authoritarian lines that are not aligned with our values on human rights and freedom and democracy. So it's a big issue globally, and I don't think the world will be the same for quite some time as a result of it.
Thank you, General Jones. And as usual, you were ahead of me. I was just about to turn the conversation to the framework that President Biden used in his Poland speech a week or so ago. Putting this squarely in the context of democracies versus autocracies, and talking about a long-term effort. And one of the questions I had, and I know you travel a lot in the Middle East and elsewhere, is that the rest of the world, we certainly have the US and Europe and key democratic allies in Asia with us, countering Putin's sanctions, sending supplies and humanitarian aid, et cetera. But it seems to me from the UN votes and other data that large parts of the world are not with us. They're either neutral or they're in favor of Putin. So, in Africa, in the Middle East, you saw some key votes that some of our partners did not take our side. And I know there's a lot of information and propaganda operations, in the rest of the world. But when you look at most of the world's population, it's a little bit disconcerting to see that they're not really with us. And so how do we think about that? And I know you have so much experience in these regions. How do we think about that for the purposes of Taiwan and more broadly?
I'm sorry, Barry, is that directed to me?
Yeah, because you spend so much time in the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere. How do we, the rest of the world does not seem to be against Putin in a very clear way. And so if this is a struggle of democracies against autocracies, how do we get the rest of the world, including India, but also Middle East and Africa, kind of on our side? What's your assessment of why they're not? Just would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's a complex issue, but as you mentioned, I do spend quite a bit of time in the Middle East and elsewhere, and in my NATO days, I was very interested in how the African continent was developing in light of the Chinese push to essentially become the largest trading partner for the continent, replacing us some years ago. I think that for the future, the United States really needs to send some very clear messages to the rest of the world, really, that this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and we intend to be a dominant presence and honor our commitments and live up to our values and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard, because I think for one reason or the other, I think we have lost some of our leadership skills in terms of how we communicate with our friends and allies. And it starts with basic things like sending ambassadors to sovereign countries that are important. In the Middle East, for example, we still don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. We don't have an ambassador in the UAE. We may not think that's a big thing, but they think it's a big thing. And they draw conclusions from the fact that, when one administration replaces another, virtually all political appointees are, asked to resign. There are some terrific ambassadors that are out there and would be happy to stay on until properly relieved by another ambassador. We tried that when I was working in the Obama administration, and Secretary Clinton was very supportive of that idea. And we did do that, but the Trump administration, of course, when they came in, decided absolutely no way are we going to keep democratically appointed ambassadors. And as a result, you have this void of commitment that is interpreted as, being showing a lack of interest in the relationship. There are some little things that could be done that send huge messages, and we just don't seem to be capable of doing that. And I don't, for the life of me, understand why. With regard to Michelle's comment, which I think is absolutely correct about the Congress and trying to pass a new trade deal. I mean, this is indicative of a Congress that is no longer interested in national security as a bipartisan issue, but as a partisan issue. This is really important. This trade relationship in the Pacific is really, really important. Even in South Korea, about a year ago, I was in Seoul, South Korea, and it was explained to me just how penetrating the Chinese influence is in South Korea. 25% of the South Korean GDP is now tied to China, and that's expanding. And so, when the Chinese want to tighten the reins on the South Korean government, they now have an economic access to South Korean businesses that don't have any relations with the U.S. but are tied to China, and so that can affect South Korean politics at some point. So to me, this is a very complicated issue. There's no single solution, in the sense there's not a military solution and nothing else. It's very complex. It's a whole of government engagement, and frankly, if we need to do some transformation in the State Department so that it can operate more effectively, i.e., in the prompt naming of ambassadors and showing that these are important positions and we value the relationships. Until we're able to fix little things like that, the big things are going to be harder to do.
Really important points, General Jones. Thank you. Michelle, I know you have thoughts on this broader question too, of how do we bring others onto our side in the global challenges?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would hope we would do coming out of this crisis is to do a sort of systematic assessment of where are there Russian dependencies that we should actively help reduce. So the most obvious one is European dependence on Russian oil and gas, and we should be, instituting a 10-year plan to help them reorient and dramatically reduce that vulnerability over the coming years. Similarly, India, I mean, I've heard from friends in India that one of the reasons they have felt constrained in speaking out against Russia is less an ideological issue and more that they are so dependent on Russia for spare parts for their military that if Russia got angry and cut off their spare parts supply, they literally would not have any ready forces on the line of control with China. And so we can help with that. We can work with them over time to wean them off Soviet equipment, Russian equipment, and help them get to a more modern military that doesn't have that dependency. So I think I'd love to see some systematic analysis that looks at where are these dependencies on Russia. And I think that's worth doing with regard to, China as well, particularly in those key technology areas where we have to maintain our edge. So if you took semiconductors, for example, obviously the US is playing a critical role. Taiwan with TSMC is playing a critical role. Japan, Korea, the Netherlands because of ASML, and the machines that they produce. So you could imagine a sort of cluster of allies or partners that are really working together to try to safeguard key technology areas vis-a-vis China, co-investing together to keep our edge, widen the gap that China has in terms of catching up, and also bolstering our economic and trade relationships in the process. So I think there's some room to do some strategic analysis to say, where do we want to reduce dependencies among our friends, and where do we want to enhance our edge by working with allies? And then to General Jones's point, some areas like the Middle East, we have got to re-engage the Middle East and have a much more, regain some strategic alignment in dealing with things like the challenge from Iran and other threats that we face in common. Why aren't we leaning forward and proactively getting counter drone defense or better air and missile defense to them? Given the threat that they're facing from Iran and the Houthis and so forth. That is whatever's gone on, and I understand the very real differences because of the Khashoggi murder, because of how certain behaviors and approaches in the Yemen civil war. But we do have a common goal, common interest in helping them defend themselves against Iranian and Houthi attacks, and we should be leaning into that much more in a much more forward way, in my view.
Barry, if I could just piggyback on that a little bit. I think there's a couple of areas where the U.S. leadership would be critical at this time, and actually a game changer if we chose to do it. And one Michelle just mentioned is cybersecurity. We are locked in a battle for supremacy in the cybersecurity and other technologies, but cybersecurity is one of the areas where both in the public and private sector, we could be not only helping ourselves, but helping our friends and allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization achieve much greater degrees of security for their critical infrastructure, for their public and private sector ambitions. And then the other one is energy. The United States has the potential to offer game-changing assistance to our friends and allies, especially those that are dependent on Russia. The Atlantic Council, as you well know, has had the 3 Cs initiative alive and well now for several years. One of the components of the 3 Cs initiative is energy flow, and I think that I really think that we should be use that as part of one of the major points where countries that are so dependent on Russian oil and gas have an alternative. And I think by opening up our capabilities of shaping the future on energy for countries that are dependent is something that we should do as a matter of not only the fact that it's the right thing to do, but it's also an international security imperative, I think.
Great, thank you, General Jones, and I'm really glad that you raised energy security. I should have raised that earlier in the conversation, and this is relevant to what was going to be my last question before we turn to some of the audience questions. And Dr. O is always thinking about the Quad and about partnerships the U.S. Initiates between Atlantic and Indo-Pacific allies and partners, and so the Quad's efforts and AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US effort, Are there other things we could be thinking about again now regarding alignments between Atlantic and Pacific allies in the U.S. to strengthen deterrence against Chinese aggression on Taiwan, either cybersecurity, energy security, military? What countries are not yet sort of close to the U.S. and Taiwan that we'd want to get a little closer? And that question can be for both General Jones and Undersecretary Flournoy.
Sure.
I defer to the former Undersecretary.
So I do think we want to keep putting meat on the bones of the Quad, which I think this administration has been doing a great job of really deepening the relationships among those countries and having concrete areas of cooperation and collaboration. And I think further developing that is very important. And same with AUKUS, everybody talks about the submarine deal, very strategic, very important, but it's going to take a generation to realize. So a lot of the, how do we create some early wins, some quick wins, some momentum in that relationship through other means, working together on emerging technologies or on energy security or on, whatever the agenda is. So I think that's there. But back to General, Jones's point about, we need to show up. One of the most important places we need to show up is ASEAN. Back in the Obama administration, we had some real diplomatic successes in kind of energizing the vast majority of ASEAN states to join with us in pushing back against some of China's worst behavior, most aggressive, most egregious behaviors, violations of the UN law of the sea, violations of other countries' territorial sovereignty and maritime approaches and so forth. And so that is such an important forum. We're not a member, but there are fora where we participate, like the ADMM Plus and so forth. So we need to show up in Southeast Asia, as well as, in the Quad and with AUKUS and so forth, and really, send our ambassadors, lean in diplomatically, but also find, in the absence of an overarching regional trade agreement, really double down on finding ways to deepen our economic engagement bilaterally and maybe, trilaterally or quadrilaterally with key states in the region. And again, it needs to be strategic and proactive. And I understand it's very difficult when there's a crisis like a war in the heart of Europe going on to get that leader bandwidth and to think over the horizon beyond the crisis of the day. But we have to do that. We have to find some parts of the government. You and I both worked in strategy offices before. That's their job, supported by FFRDCs, supported by think tanks, to come up with some of those new strategic initiatives. And we desperately need to continue pursuing those in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you both. Let me start turning to the questions now. I'll take them in order from strategy to specific issues. I think the first one I'd take would be from Jack Krupansky, who is a freelance consultant. And he says, what similarities and differences are there between the various forms of strategic ambiguity regarding both Ukraine and Taiwan? In the case of Ukraine, there's been ambiguity over whether Ukraine would actually be admitted to NATO anytime soon as a member. Their EU application now, it sounds like, is on a fast track, according to Ursula von der Leyen. But a question I think I would raise is it, because this is about Taiwan, is this a time to move a little bit beyond or a lot beyond the policies inherited from the Cold War in terms of the US commitment, which both of you had spoken about quite eloquently and specifically, the US commitment to help defend Taiwan? Or do you think we're in a good place despite the strategic shocks?
I'm happy to jump on that grenade first. So, my own view is that strategic ambiguity is, sometimes frustrating as it is as a construct. It actually has served a number of good purposes. in terms of, I think if we were to abandon it entirely, as some like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been advocating, I think you'd provoke a major crisis with China. I think the other thing that's less appreciated is strategic ambiguity creates a framework, creates space for other countries to have relationships with Taiwan. Maybe not official relationships, but it allows them to engage with Taiwan in very useful and beneficial ways that if we got rid of that and they were forced to, okay, now you have to choose sides, I fear that it would actually, isolate Taiwan internationally even further. So I'm more in favor of, taking an actions speak louder than words approach. So leave the strategic ambiguity framework in place, but through our actions and through our statements, saying things like, an unprovoked aggression against Taiwan would be taken as a very serious threat to the rules-based order, to our national interests. You can make a lot of statements under the umbrella of strategic ambiguity that are communicating or clarifying U.S. resolve. And then you can also, through our actions, working with Taiwan in bolstering its defenses. I think that frankly, Beijing is going to pay a lot more attention to what we do than what we say. And I think we can bolster our ability to communicate that commitment through our actions. So those are my thoughts, but I'd love to know if General Jones thinks of it differently.
Well, I think I'm in total agreement with you, Michelle. I do think that we are in a very important time when democracies are under attack, and it's time for the unquestioned leader of the free world to reassert itself in that capacity, and that means a lot of different things. One of my impressions is that on your point about actions speaking louder than words, I completely agree with that. I think we in our haste to be seen as the freest of all societies, that we talk too much and we telegraph things that force our opponents to maybe sometimes feel like they're back into a corner by virtue of what we say, and then they have to say something else, and before you know it, you have a crisis. So I think on Taiwan, that might be a good thing to do. I think we need to act decisively, and I don't think we need to telegraph everything that we do. I think on trade, though, I think that's a good one to telegraph. I think that you want to be unequivocal there. On the military aspect of things, I think, we need to make sure that the Taiwanese are capable of defending themselves or deterring an attack. That's an art form in itself to try to figure out what that means. But it doesn't have to be, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be reported on the front pages of major newspapers around the world, because it forces a country like China to have to react to that, and then you have a bigger problem. But I think that around the world we need a more proactive and more visible presence. One that shores up our commitments and restates unequivocally what we stand for, and we show by our actions that we mean what we say.
Great, thank you very much. That's a really helpful. Those are both helpful answers, I think, for informing our community going forward. We have another good question from Karis Templeman, who's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And they say, I worry that by focusing solely on threats rather than reassurance, the U.S. is not helping to stabilize the cross-strait security environment and instead is contributing to an insecurity spiral. right now over Taiwan. Beijing's military exercises and bellicose language are intended not as a precursor to invasion, but as a signal to the US to stop backing up the Tsai administration in Taiwan. The US responds by loosening restrictions of our One China policy and selling more arms to Taiwan and so forth. So the question is, what would you recommend to reverse this insecurity spiral? And I think that's good for either Undersecretary Flournoy or General Jones.
Sounds awfully much like a policy question.
So, I see it a bit of, I understand the concern behind the question. We don't want to get into a downward spiral that sort of provokes a crisis that no one wants or leads to some kind of miscalculation. And that is always a very real risk. But I do think that the reason why we're needing to bolster our support to Taiwan's defense is because of the increasing coercive and aggressive nature of Chinese behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan and in the region more broadly. So if that muscle flexing, if that intimidation was not happening, I think, I put the responsibility for sort of reducing tensions squarely on the shoulders of Beijing. Given their violation of Taiwan's air defense zone, their threatening rhetoric, their infiltration of Taiwan's social media with very hostile, aggressive messaging, just their whole campaign is really ramping up the tension. And I think what we're trying to communicate is to say, no, we are going to stand by our commitments to the rules-based order in the region. So when you violate other countries' maritime areas or air defense zones, we're going to do freedom of navigation operations to demonstrate that we're upholding international law as it's commonly understood. When you threaten Taiwan with all these incursions and hostile rhetoric, we're going to make sure that we're bolstering our support to them to defend themselves effectively. So again, I put the responsibility, if we want to reduce tensions over the cross straits, we got to start in Beijing, and a decision by Xi to do that.
I have a little brief statement and a question for Michelle, actually. So my statement would be that I don't think a military incursion by China in Taiwan, especially after what has happened to the Russians in its incursion in the Ukraine, where Ukraine has shown that it's fighting for its freedom, and the likelihood is that the Taiwanese would do the same thing. But I think China probably would create an incident to test U.S. resolve in the South China Sea before they tried for the Big Apple of Taiwan. That's just my personal opinion. My question is, Michelle, a few years ago when I was last in Taiwan, I was struck by the amount of trade that was going on between China and Taiwan on a daily basis, with governors all over China, and it seemed to be a going concern, a going business rather. What's the status of Taiwan's dependency on the Chinese economy today, since you've just been there?
Yeah, no, I think when I talk about absorption into the Borg, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I think China has increased its own direct investment in Taiwan. It's increased its ownership of companies in Taiwan. It has also welcomed Taiwanese investment on the mainland. It is actively recruiting talent away from Taiwan to the mainland. One of the biggest areas of focus is, recruiting TSMC talent into China to help them with their own indigenous chip making industry by offering people outrageously high salaries that are difficult to match. So I do think the preferred approach that China has is to create so much economic interdependency that they have real leverage to push their agenda or change behavior or moderate Taiwan's behavior in the political domain. And I mean, they'd prefer a sort of Hong Kong type of approach as opposed to military intervention. My point, though, is I don't think she will take military intervention off the table. If it comes to that, I think he would do that, but it's not his preferred approach. I think he will use economic absorption or integration and political coercion to try to achieve his goals vis-a-vis Taiwan before he reaches for use of force.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, General Jones, for helping the moderator. We have one more question from Rachel Oswald at CQ Roll Call, and this is for General Jones. And she asks, can General Jones expand on his earlier comments about other African and Western Hemisphere leaders watching to see how Putin emerges from this conflict? Which leaders, countries are you thinking of? What types of isolation are needed of Putin in order to send the message that Putin is still a pariah? And she would welcome if you were specific in terms of sanctions, membership in multilateral bodies, travel for summits, etc. So what types of countries do you think are watching, and what types of things would isolation look like, I think?
Well, it's, I'm not sure that I want to get into naming particular specific countries, but I will say that, the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been the center mass for a number of years as to which way it's going to go, right? There's still a lot of corruption. There's still, it's a huge country. I mean, you can put all of most of Europe in the Congo, and in one province, and alone you could put France and Germany in and still have a third of the province left over. So, I mean, to me, the Congo has always been kind of center mass on whether it's going to be a democratic country and it's going to have free and fair elections and it's going to move away from corruption, and the Chinese incursion in most of Africa is a matter of record now. They show up in many countries with a bag of gold, put that on the table, and say, "This is for you." Now, let's talk about what we can do here. And by and large, in Africa, China has bullied its way to these economic deals. Their work has not been particularly impressive. A lot of the things they've built are already falling apart. They certainly have not done what the West usually does, is participating in training of local people and making their lives better. They built these compounds that are Chinese only. In Algeria, they sent prison ships with Chinese prisoners to do the work of a contractor. Nothing there for the Algerians to benefit by. So they've been successful, and they've been clumsy at the same time. And inevitably, in many countries in Africa, when you travel there, or when I travel there, and I'm sure Michelle and others, when they travel, you hear this same refrain: "Where are you? Why aren't you here anymore?" We don't have any choice but to deal with China because you're not offering anything. So that's the kind of relationship that we need to reinvigorate and be more effective. I think more partnership between the U.S. government and the U.S. private sector, the Chamber of Commerce. If we had more public to private sector encouragement, I think that we could do a lot more in places like the African continent. But what's going on in North Africa right now in Libya, we have, in my view, we should be very interested in getting Libya back on its feet. I think the Libyans generally like the United States and want to see the U.S. involved in this, but in their recovery. And in other parts of Africa, where you do have autocratic leaders, they should be paying attention to what's going on with Vladimir Putin in particular, because it could be a precursor to how they're going to be treated globally, particularly on the human rights corruption question and everything else.
Thank you, General Jones. I have an excellent question from our own Dmitry Bergoltsev. I'll summarize it because we're almost at our appointed end time, but he points to the Russia and China working together to promote anti-American narratives and conspiracies domestically, COVID-19, originating in the US or in US biolabs in Ukraine, clearly ramping up domestic support, is key for the CCP in any eventual, if there's any conflict with Taiwan. And in addition, there's growing evidence of Russia and China coordinating their disinformation efforts abroad. Is there a silver bullet? Because we're almost out of time, but what can the U.S. and its allies and partners do to counter these efforts, these coordinated disinformation efforts, both domestically in Russia and China, but also across the entire developing world? And this could be a factor in these countries not having openly condemned Russia's invasion.
I'll take a stab at that. And my feelings on this. I believe that that one of the gifts of the 20th century has been the ability to have the United States military welcome geographically in many different commands around the world. Now, we've had some retrenchment over the last 10, 20 years, but basically the U.S. Unified commands are still very welcome, in different parts of the world. I think it's time to give serious thought to expanding the capabilities of those commands beyond just a military presence. I mean, I know in the Rumsfeld days, we changed the name from to combatant commanders. I think that's a big mistake. But nonetheless, that's the term of art that we use. But I prefer to call them unified commands, and I believe that one way to improve U.S. engagement across the board would be to have a senior ambassador assigned to a particular region. For instance, in Africa, we have 5 regions, so you'd have a senior ambassador who would be married up with his counterpart in the military at the U.S. AFRICOM, which I hope someday will move to Africa. But we'd also have senior representatives of the interagency, trade, commerce, energy, treasury, and the like. And I think that by having a forward-based operational level of engagement, that the United States could compete more successfully with the Chinese interventions, particularly beyond the military thing. The military thing, we do that really well, but as long as everything is run from Washington, from the strategic to the operational and tactical level, you really you don't really react in the same time frame, in the same time zone. And I think we could do a lot to reshape the presence that we already have and expand it so it could be more capable and more responsive and build better relations in real time with what our national goals and aspirations are.
Thank you, General Jones. Michelle, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say three things. First is I think in terms of a U.S. offering that can compete with whatever China offers, I think working with countries to ensure that their populations have free and open access to the internet, whether that's laying, fiber cable or providing satellite-based access or what have you, but really opening up the information ecosystem in these countries to make sure that other narratives are being heard. Number two is I do think we need something akin to a 21st century digital version of USIA. We used to have U.S. Information Agency, which would sort of get the U.S. message out, whether it was libraries in key cities around the world or Voice of America or whatever. And I think the forms need to be updated to be resonant in the 21st century and a lot more focus on social media and so forth. But we need an effort to kind of get the US message out. I'm not saying propaganda, I'm just saying get the facts out, like where is the story explaining what those labs really were in Ukraine, which is not what the Chinese and Russians say they were. And then lastly, as part of our democracy building work, really investing in journalism and free and open media in these countries, again, who can do investigative reporting, question a narrative, present the facts, to the local population and so forth. So I do think there are ways that we can create a different ecosystem that maybe at least has some counterweights to the disinformation and misinformation coming from Russia and China.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And unfortunately, we're out of time. We had many, many more questions than we've had time to get to. This has been a special treat for me, having worked for both of you. And also, I hope for the audience, hearing your really specific suggestions and insights about the implications for Taiwan and geopolitics, really, of the ongoing Russian invasion. So thank you both. We really appreciate it. On behalf of the Atlantic Council and General Jones, I was negligent in not mentioning, is the chair of our Scowcroft Center. So thanks for his leadership there. But also thank you, Undersecretary Flournoy. And everyone, and please stay tuned for a lot more from the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and the Asia Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Michelle.